This is Catonia, the world of the dark feminine. I would like to take a moment to talk about an exciting new project under the Catonia banner, the Institute for the Study of Feminine Myth. Looking to bust the patriarchy? In order to bring feminine balance to our collective culture, we have to examine and rework our collective myths. The ISFM aims to do just that, and to help people find their own creative voices as part of a move towards new thought for the 21st century. Check out the GoFundMe link in the description box for both the audio and YouTube versions of the podcast for a full video on the project and an opportunity to donate to this important work. Hello, this is Breege Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Politi, John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Jeffrey B., Gabby, Helen M., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Allie, Thaddeus G., V! V., Mary Beth R., Ida B., Eric N., Tana, and May. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there's so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Catonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Catonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm Breege Burke, your host, and we are going to continue our discussion from last week. We were talking about, well, I shouldn't say last week, the week before, where we were talking about Nick Nevin, who is portrayed as a kind of witch queen that was seen in witch trial accounts, and it seems to be a name that has its origins in Scotland and has a lot to do with, it seems to be more of a literary name rather than something that then maybe an actual name for witches or witch queens. Could have been one of a variety of names. But Nick Nevin is sometimes called the Scottish Hecate, but she's also sometimes referred to as a darker version of the Queen of Elfame. And the Queen of Elfame is going to be our subject for today. Now, when I dove into this subject, which I'm doing, just by the way, as a side note, in the midst of trying to get the Institute for the Study of Feminine Myth open and off the ground, we start classes next Wednesday. So if you're listening to this podcast when it first comes out, probably around would be on the 30th of September. Classes start that Wednesday, so people who are interested, check out the website. I will have a promo for that at the beginning of this. But I've been doing so much work on that I'm trying to make sure I provide certain Patreon-only podcasts for for Patreon, obviously, for paid subscribers. And I'm also wanting to make sure that I keep up with these episodes. So sitting down to kind of do the research for this, there's quite a rabbit hole that one could go down with this, and there's probably only so far I can go in a podcast under normal circumstances. So we're going to do the best that we can with it. Now, Queen of Elfame is an interesting kind of term. Now, the way that this term has been defined, at the beginning of Wikipedia, they say Queen of Elfame or Elf-Hame, Elf being spelled, Elfame being spelled ELPHAME or ELF-HAME. And they say that the Hame stem only occurs in conjectural reconstructed orthography in the folkloric belief of Lowland Scotland, and Northern England, designates the elfin queen of faerie mentioned in Scottish witch trials. In ballads and contemporary texts, she's referred to as the Queen of Elfane, Elfen, or of the fairies. Okay, so we are referring to a fairy queen here when we talk about the Queen of Elfame. She is the equivalent of the Queen of Faerie, who rules Faerie or Fairy land. The character, as described in witch trials, has many parallels with the legends of Thomas the Rhymer and Tam Lin. So we're gonna talk about this idea of the Queen of Faerie. And this raises, just like with Nick Nevin, because there seem to be so many possible associations here, and they're all things that we can see those who follow this podcast regularly certainly know that when we talk about fairy, and then we talk about themes of maybe Irish myth, and maybe themes of witchcraft, and just other kinds of medieval folklore about heaven, about hell, about the states in between heaven and hell, and things like that. It's all, our notion of fairy and fairyland tends to come out of this. So what I really want to do in this episode, I was trying to piece through all the material, not only the stuff that I found online on, Wikipedia, on people's blogs, on websites, but also just digging a little bit into the scholarship on it as well, just to see what has been said about Queen of Elfame as a term. And so I'm going to talk about that. We're going to get into kind of meaning of the term, what a fairy is, what do we mean by that, and what do we mean by a fairy queen, okay? Because this is not, it's not always necessarily used for the literal queen of fairy. We also see this sometimes applied in some cases as a queen of witches. Again, that connection to Nick Nevin there. And we see this as a figure that can be linked to certain things that are probably connected to witchcraft, like midwifery, for example. We have sometimes, there's at least one reference. And of course, then we want to look at the idea of the Queen of Fairy from Thomas the Rhymer and Tam Lin, which are two prominent examples. But I can tell you from having read Irish folk tales, if you read Yeats in particular, if you read his collection of stories on fairies and fairy lore, and there are tales in there of the Queen of Fairy appearing and stealing beautiful children and things like that, who are out at the wrong time. They're out playing and they don't come home quite on time, and as they're going home at dusk, then they encounter the queen of the fairies, and if she thinks it's a beautiful child, then she'll steal the child and take the child away. So this leads to a lot of questions too about what do we mean by fairyland, and what do we mean by these conceptions of fairies, because certainly if you go to Ireland, the conception of fairy is, obviously there are stories and tales, there's local legends, there's the folklore we have, there's the medieval literature, and the literature that we've seen throughout the Renaissance, the Victorian period. Different, the ideas about fairies have certainly taken a certain shape over that period of time. But then, of course, if you actually go to Ireland to fairy sites, and you know about the superstition, well, I'm not even going to call it superstition, the rules around those sites, because I don't know that all those rules are necessarily superstition, at least not in my personal experience. So I want to talk a bit about that as well. And also, so among the themes we're going to look at here is not only fairyland as this kind of in-between place, or this underworld type place, and the different conceptions that we have from what we might think of as probably the medieval period. That's the earliest written literature that we're going to have. Although probably the concept of what we now think of as fairy or fairyland is much older than that. From those conceptions to much more modern ones, and one of the curious things about fairyland for me, just using that term, that's not the term I would necessarily use for it, but if we think of it as fairyland, is its relationship to time. I think that's a very interesting aspect of this idea of the realm of fairies and what it means and what the implications are of it. And probably I'm going to finish up with a little bit of a discussion of liminality, which is being on the border, being on the edge. And fairies are certainly figures, I think our modern figures in the broader, I'll say the wider world, the world of the internet, the world of, a lot of places that UFOs and things like that and aliens may have, at least archetypally, not entirely taken the place of fairies, but they are sort of a more modern version of that particular type of liminal being. Now, again, not to say that fairies and aliens are the same thing, because they're not. It's just that we are talking about creatures that come from, we assume that aliens are something that come from outer space. So that's more of a liminal threshold between our world and outer worlds, wherever there might be life besides on Earth. Whereas fairy is something that is very much terrestrial. It is part of the earth and often conceived of as being something under the earth and very strongly connected to the natural world. So, okay, so let's dive in here with our little... We have our agenda set here. Okay, so looking back here... Okay, so now I'm just moving on to the history of the usage of the term. The actual text spelling, which is more Middle English, probably Old to Middle English in its variation, is Queen of Elfame, Queene, which is how queen is spelled there, of Elfame, Elfame. And it says the actual text, that's the actual spelling in that and other variants in witch trial transcripts. Okay, so this is where the term comes from, at least originally. The supposition of an HAME stem leading to the etymological meaning of elf home in the Scots language is speculative on the part of Robert Pitcairn, the modern editor. Yeah, so in other words, people have added this HAME to say like, oh, this is the home or the land. The implication is that's what that suffix means, but we don't actually... That's still... Like a lot of these, they're etymologically questionable. And interestingly, where we get the term Queen of Elfame from, the way it's used quite repeatedly in more modern ways of talking about ancient belief or folklore of the islands of Ireland, of Scotland, of England, perhaps. There's the way that it's the source of it is somebody who is trying to take a lot of license with etymologies that, as we've seen when we've talked about different figures, to try to say, for example, okay, I don't want to get too abstract here. The term Morgan, and Morgan. Okay, so people will say, oh, Morrigan is the same as Morgan Le Fay, or they're pretty much, because they both have this M-O-R root. But, of course, in Irish, M-O-R, that root means great, or sometimes there's an implication of something spectral or phantom, depending on whether you're talking about more Middle Irish or more Modern Irish. There's different, it has a different inflection. More, as in Morgan, actually refers more to the Welsh, no pun intended there, refers to the Welsh term that has to do with the sea, M-O-R, which is more of a root that is connected to to being connected to the sea, and comes from a different language family. So to simply say, oh, well, they sound the same, so they're the same, is never a good strategy, at least not a good academic strategy. Even if we can look at some of these figures and see a correspondence, even if we can say, oh, there does seem to be some similarity in role or in what they do, or because some of the ancient figures of who we think of as goddesses in the ancient Irish landscape or the Celtic landscape, which, as I've said, are not necessarily the same thing. There is the idea that witches, in particular, are bound up with these figures, because witches also tend to, in addition to being connected to the devil, also tend to be connected to fairies and fairyland. So let's go back to our history of usage here. Okay, so it says, the Dictionary of the Older Scottish Tongue lists only the Elfame and Elfine, E-L-P-H-Y-N-E spellings, both defined as fairyland. Now, okay, so they talk about a lot of the different various spellings that people have of that term. And so they say the Queen of Elfame designation was only used in isolated instances in the 19th century, and that, just to be clear, is the spelling E-L-P-H-A-M-E. Serious scholarship on Thomas the Rhymer, for example, generally does not employ this spelling, but it was embraced by Robert Graves, who used Queen of Elfame in his works. Usage has since spread in various popular publications, and therein lies the problem. Because Robert Graves has a tremendous amount of influence on modern witchcraft. I remember even the days when I first was learning about witchcraft. Now, this was back in the 80s when, you don't have internet groups, when you didn't have as much contact with people, where what I had was Doreen Valiente, or even Gerald Gardner's works, or Margot Adler, Starhawk. I remember reading all of these different books. And of course, everybody was always referred to, by all of these sources, Robert Graves' work, The White Goddess in particular. And what Graves does is he tries to create these kinds of etymologies and say, oh, this one's similar to this one, And this is actually the same reference to this. And he comes up with these ways that what he calls, because he says he's not, if we talk about the white goddess in particular, Robert Graves would say that he proposes the existence, I'm just going to read to you about the text, of a European deity, the white goddess of birth, love, and death, similar to the mother goddess, inspired and represented by phases of the moon, who lies behind the faces of diverse goddesses of various European and pagan mythologies. Graves argues that true or pure poetry is inextricably linked with the ancient cult ritual of his proposed white goddess and of her son. And he basically indicates that he is not really a grammarian, okay? That he's not a linguist, and not even an anthropologist, but that he is a poet, and that this is the way he's trying to sort of fancifully render these things. Now, I'm just going to read to you the criticism that's mentioned here of Graves is quite appropriate. The White Goddess has been seen as a poetic work where Graves gives his notion of a man's subjection to women in love and an anthropological grandeur, and further mythologizes all women in general, and several of Graves's lovers in particular, in a three-faced moon goddess model. Graves' value as a poet aside, flaws in his scholarship, such as poor philology, use of inadequate texts, and outdated archaeology has been criticized. Some scholars, particularly archaeologists, historians, and folklorists, have rejected the work, which T.S. Eliot called a prodigious, monstrous, stupefying, indescribable book. And Graves himself was disappointed that his work was loudly ignored by many Celtic scholars, as it should have been. It says, however, the White Goddess was accepted as history by many non-scholarly readers. Yeah, and that gets back to the problem of the history of witchcraft. When we talk about modern witchcraft and the assertions that have been made about it, and these are... And I remember even back in the 90s, Gnosis magazine did a piece about the absolute stupefying lack of scholarship in witchcraft and the claims that people would make about witchcraft origins or witch lineages and things like that, which were they were completely fanciful and unprovable and very much romanticized. And it says, so we're talking about this. Ronald Hutton would say that the White Goddess remains a major source of confusion about the ancient Celts and influences many unscholarly views of Celtic paganism. Yeah, in the book I hopefully will have coming out at some point I don't even know what date I could even say at this point, because I don't know quite when Theon's going to be putting it out at this point, but I've written the book The Phantom Queen, and I go into this whole idea about what is Celtic quite extensively, at least in the first part of the book. And they have Hilda Ellis Davidson criticized Graves as having misled many innocent readers with his eloquent but deceptive statements about a nebulous goddess in early Celtic literature, and stated that he was no authority on the subject matter presented. While Graves made the association between goddesses and the moon appear natural, it was not so to the Celts or some other ancient peoples. In response to critics, Graves accused literary scholars of being psychologically incapable of interpreting myth, or too concerned with maintaining their own prerequisites to go against the majority view. And I would say, as somebody who does psychology of myth, that Graves is wrong. I've also read, weirdly in grad school, that was the one, I don't want to call it a bone of contention, but it was the one disagreement point that I had with my dissertation director, who had us get the collection of Greek myths that was put out and edited and prefaced by Graves. And it is a terrible, terrible book in the sense of, from a scholarly perspective it is, because, the myths and the way he writes them may be interesting and so forth, but they're more of his own fanciful poetical interpretation. His myth theory that he outlines in the preface to his book, which I do have my students read at the beginning of the term, is just, it's nonsense, a lot of it. It's just, it's this idea that he makes these kinds of connections and things. He does kind of the same thing that Fraser did in The Golden Bough, which again, when The Golden Bough came out, that was considered to be a monumental work of mythology and mythological interpretation. Particularly, it was supposed to be a work of kind of anthropology and also maybe a work of psychology of myth. Like, it was the first attempts to kind of link that kind of material together. But all of it is, there's just problems all the way around. You might read those texts and say, okay, those texts are interesting. But they're not, there's very little in there that really accurately represents myth scholarship. It really doesn't. It tries to draw connections that may be more that are more about Western psychology, that are more about the maybe even the views of the writers themselves in trying to interpret things. And this is where the idea of trying to interpret myth archetypally became a problem scholarly, where people were trying to say, no, it's garbage, that's nonsense. And it's not. And so like I said, I was saying this, another thing about Jordan Peterson and Jung the other day. I'm not going to go back into that discussion because I've been into it like 12 times already. But I get, when I see certain scholarship that's used or misused in a certain way, or is just, again, if somebody's just doing it as a fancy, but to try to put it forth as the actual history is another thing entirely. If he wanted to write, fictional works or whatever that were inspired by these stories or by his interpretation of fairy tales, fine. Lots of people do that. Go to town, but don't represent it as the actual history because you don't know what that is. And so there's a lot that's wrong with this way of doing things. So, and Graves is somebody who I have a particular beef with. And so part of the problem too is there's another, Barbara Walker. Now I love Barbara Walker's tarot deck. And she has this Dictionary of Women's Mysteries, I think it's called. No, Women's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets. That's what it's called. And again, Walker has some interesting stuff in there, but you have to take everything with a grain of salt because she does a very similar thing. She tries to say, oh, this one's the same as this one, and this one's the same as this one, and this one, and oh, this, like for example, in reading about what she says about fairies, the fairy queen was obviously an ancient fertility mother, because that's the other thing too. This is, Graves really promoted the myth of the matriarchy. And the myth of the matriarchy is just, it's there's no evidence for it. That's the problem with it. There's no evidence for it, and while Cynthia Eller and I do disagree on quite a few things, I mean, it's some of her later writings. I mean, I know her. And I like her. I mean, she's very clearly she's very scholarly in what she does, but I feel. I don't agree with everything she's written. Some of it I'm just kind of like, yeah, I think your premise is completely wrong, especially when she talks about dark goddesses and colonialism. She ends up kind of going off in the wrong tangent for me. But what she does say about the myth of the matriarchy, I completely agree with. And she says, in espousing such a myth, that we all came from the mother until the terrible patriarchs ripped everything away from us, is a ridiculous mythology. It's not, well, I don't know. She doesn't say that. I think it is. Okay, let me back up and be a little fair here, because I'm getting a little bit editorializing quite a bit about it. It doesn't really have any evidence, and what she says is that it's not a kind of, as she puts it, the subtitle to her book is Why an Invented Past Won't Give Women a Future. Women today do not want to be known as just the mother. There's a lot of problems with assuming that women are supposed to be mothers, that it plays right into the mythology that says, that's your role, is to be a container of babies, that's your destiny in life, and that all mythology kind of revolves around that. And, that there was this beautiful ancient mother cult. And I've said countless times, and I'll only say it here, and then I better move on because I'm digressing. I can tell big time here. There's ancient mother goddess worship is very bloody and not represented. It does not represent this this kind of benign cult, of grandma baking cookies, if you want to use that kind of association. Mother goddess worship has not ever been that. It usually, those are the cults that would involve things like human sacrifice often. And again, I'm not saying that to trash them. I'm simply pointing out that, and even still, like, there's a lot of goddesses who still, in certain cultures, might even still get, like, animal sacrifice and things like that. The castration was frequent in those cults. I mean, it's not, they're not necessarily, they're not, it's not like, oh, we were all nice and peaceful and then we got all of this violent stuff. It's like, no, the mother goddess cults were violent. And there's ample evidence of that. Which I'm not going to, again, I'm digressing. But, so anyway, Robert Graves just kind of set me off on a tangent here. Let's get back to the Queen of Elfame. Okay, so anyway, that's the usage, and that's why everybody uses the phrase in that way. So, okay, So I'm going to talk about where she's mentioned, but I want to shift over to the idea of a fairy. What is a fairy? Well, it kind of depends on your viewpoint. I was trying to, I've talked about fairies in other podcasts, but I think what I'm going to use is Brian Froud's definition from the preface of his 1979 book, which I think kind of sums up the variations that we have here. He says, the mystery of fairy has been, from the earliest times, a subject of human speculation. What are fairies? Where did they come from? Norse mythology relates how the maggots emerging from the corpse of the giant, I think I'm going to say that, Ymir, I'm not sure if that's right, transform themselves into the light elves and dark elves. Light elves living in the air are benign, happy creatures, but dark elves whose domains are underground, the domains are the underground regions, are swarthy, evil, and blighting. Well, I don't know, that might be an oversimplification, but okay. The Icelandic version, on the other hand, states that Eve was washing all her children by the river when God spoke to her. In her awe and fear, she hid those children she had not already washed. God asked if all of her children were there, and she replied that they were. He then declared that those she had hidden from him would be hidden from man. These hidden children became the elves or fairies that were known as the Huldra folk in the Scandinavian countries. Huldra girls are exceptionally beautiful, but with long cow's tails, or else they are hollow behind, presenting only a beautiful front. Thus they fulfill the deception of their origin. It's Icelandic folklore. In Irish folklore, you will also see these references back to, like, children of Noah and so forth to describe the races that came before humans in Ireland. There's always this reference back to the Bible, which really kind of, it really betrays a medieval origin for a lot of these stories. So that's interesting. But that they're unwashed and then that they're hidden, okay? So there's definitely the idea of these representing hidden forces, certainly, whatever else you take away from that folktale. Elsewhere, fairies are believed to be fallen angels. That's another, that are either, they're not good enough for heaven, they're not bad enough for hell. And that's what he says. The heathen, he calls, or the heathen dead, as he calls them. Compelled to live forever in between in the twilight regions. Okay, in the liminal space, right? The Middle Kingdom. In Devon, for instance, pixies are considered to be the souls of unbaptized children. And yeah, that gets into the theology of limbo. And what Dante, in his Inferno, he has the layer of hell that is known as the domain of the righteous pagans. So it's actually a very pretty place, but it's not heaven. So, and again, in Christian theology, one goes to heaven, whereas that doesn't necessarily happen in other religions, like for anybody. I mean, because that's not a place for people, it's a place for gods or maybe for angels. But in any case, that was a kind of a folk theology that developed. I don't know that when it comes to the idea of limbo, which is where, at least in Catholicism, the claim is that that's where unbaptized babies go. If they were born and died before they had a chance to be baptized, then they end up in limbo, and that's where we have the term, being in limbo, right? But there's no, but that is not actually part of theology. But it is also something that the church doesn't tend to discourage people from believing either. Okay. So it says, these beliefs stem only from the advent of Christianity, baptism being unknown prior to that time, and hence cannot be regarded as reliable. Well, yeah. Fairies are very ancient and predates Christianity by several millennia. Moreover, it exists and has existed in varying forms in many countries all over the world. Okay. So when we think about fairies, I think we mainly are thinking about a lore. Yeah, I mean, we see it in Northern Europe. And that would include certainly Ireland, Wales, Scotland, what we think of as England, the UK, I guess is what I'm trying to get at there for all those countries except Ireland. And it's there, and then there's this, and then of course the Scandinavian countries, and then Iceland. All of these that are connected with these either Nordic or Celtic kinds of origins. And of course, if you look at the migration patterns and so forth, or invading tribes, the Celts and the Vikings certainly had a lot to do with each other at certain points in history. So you do see these overlap in beliefs. Now, the origin of it, I mean, who knows? Now, within medieval Irish literature, what they tend to think of as fairies, and in at least one a very prominent version of this. I mean, it's quite possible that there are other variations on this. But the land of the Tuatha Dé Danann, okay, they are in certain writings where they talk about, say, the Morrigan coming out of her cave at Awenigit at Samhain to meet with the Dagda and to mate, and then her hordes of specters come out of the underworld and that sort of thing. The idea is that this world or this land underneath underneath the earth, or underneath the mounds or the hills, okay, which are often known as Shi. I mean, the word Sidhe. Shi is actually a word for hill. And so when you talk about a banshee, you're really talking about the woman of the hill. In some versions, they say every hill has its own queen or has its own, which makes sense if we think about the fact that those ancient histories, they were built on ancient tribal kingdoms. So there might be different tribes of fairies with different queens or kings, as it was said. But yeah, so there's this idea that this ancient race of really what tend to be thought of as gods are now part of this area. Now, the Morrigan herself doesn't have her origin in the Tuatha Dé Danann, even though she's often considered to be part of it, or at least having sympathy for the Tuatha Dé Danann. She definitely has a connection, and she definitely fights on their side in the wars against the Fomorians and against the Firbolgs. But she also has alliances with these other tribes, and all the way back to I think I want to say Partholon, which is one of the older tribes mentioned in the Irish Book of Invasions. So some of these figures, yeah, they go back millennia, and we look at these ancient monuments that you see, these stone monuments, which are pre-Celtic. I mean, they're not something left there by the Celts, even though we tend to associate everything in that area with Celtic, right? But it's not. They're really, really old passage tombs, some of them not only Neolithic, but Mesolithic. I mean, really, really old spaces. And a lot of these tend to be connected with fairy folk because they're liminal places. And they're also very much connected to the land and to nature and to... And when you put a Christian inflection on it, it talks about the idea... There's this notion that this earth is somehow bad and corrupt and we need to escape from it. So fairies and fairyland embody that. If it embodies all of the good things, you'll hear about fairyland, or sometimes, or Elfame, or Summerland, or something like Tir na Nog. There's more than Tir na Nog. Tir na Nog is only one of the other lands or worlds, but Tir na Nog is known as the Land of Youth. Okay, and I know there's a Welsh version too, and the name's not coming to me right now, but the idea is that you have these places, and they're supposed to be where people are almost eternally young, where there's feasting all the time. It's a very, very happy place. That's why it's often called Summerland, because everything is at its peak. The days are bright and sunny. The food is plentiful. There's games. There may be, for the warriors, there may be jousting and fighting. I mean, you have some of these ideas of almost like Valhalla, where it's a hall where everybody is feasting all the time. And so fairyland is considered to be this space where there's always this kind of feasting and enjoyment of what we would think of as sensual pleasure. So when the Queen of the Fairies spots like a mortal child that she wants, that she thinks is very beautiful for whatever reason, she will bring that child to fairyland. But there's always the sense that that child wants to go home, or that the family might just see... the child will walk into the house, but the child is very pale and just sits there and may not talk, because the child is only there sort of in another dimensional space, but there. And so it becomes this whole thing of, there's stories that we see, and again, Yeats in particular is what I'm referring to, where when the Queen of Fairies, carries somebody's child off and, trying to get the child back, maybe unsuccessfully, or just seeing this child visit in this form. And the implication is, though, that the child is suffering in some way, that they're pale and they're drawn and maybe they're cold, because the idea is that the fairy feasts are actually illusions. It gets back to this idea of an illusion, that the person who's out feasting and partying and all night, and then they're doing all these things, and they receive these gifts, and then they wake up in the forest and like they're half naked and they've got like these sticks in their hand or something. Like, it's not what they thought it was, right? So there becomes this element of fairyland as representing a deception, or a glamour is the word that they cast. Now, interestingly, when we talk about the Queen of Elfhame, there is shape-shifting imagery that's connected with her. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute because we have a very similar thing in Greek mythology as well. But let me just turn for a moment to some of the sources. Okay, so first let's look at the witch trials. The Queen of Elfhame was invoked under various names in Scottish witch trials. And they mention the different forms: Queen of Elfhame, Elfane, Phanefane, in current documents from the trial of Alison Pearson in 1588. It's interesting how we got a lot of this stuff from around the 1580s, right? Because that's when we first saw the term Nick Nevin introduced as well. And the emendation to Elfhame was suggested by the editor Robert Pitcairn. Alison was carried off to Elfhame on a number of occasions over the years, where she made good acquaintance with the Queen. But rather than the Queen herself, it was mostly with her elf minions that Alice engaged in special interactions. With William Simpson, Alice's cousin or uncle, being particularly close-knitted mentor, teaching her medicinal herbs and the art of healing, which she then profited from by peddling her remedies to patients, which included the Bishop of St. Andrews. The elfin folk from this world would arrive unexpectedly, allowing her to join in their herb picking before sunrise, okay, another liminal time, and brewing their salves before her eyes. But they were often abusive, striking her in a manner that left her bereft of all her powers on her sides, rendering her bedridden for 20 weeks at a time. So the idea is that she was allowed to have something of this art, but that they were also cruel to her. The form Queen of Elfin also occurs in the 1598 witchcraft trial indictment and confession of Andrew Mann of Aberdeen. Andrew Mann confessed that as a boy he saw the quote-unquote devil, his master, in the likeness and shape of a woman who he calls the Queen of Elfin. So, okay, this is where he's trying to say that the Queen of Elfin is actually the devil, and I'll refer you to the podcast on the succubus about that particular image that I did. So, but yeah, so the idea that this is actually a she-devil, right? And as an adult, during the span of some 32 years, he had carnal relations with the Queen of Elfin, on whom he begot many bairns. Okay. So this is the man having intercourse with this female devil, which again is very reminiscent of the succubus kind of myth. Further down, however, the devil whom he calls Christ Sunday is the good man husband, though the queen has the grip of all the craft. So that's interesting that he calls him Christ Sunday is the actual husband. So that implies the incubus-succubus relationship, right? Where it's the man's nocturnal emissions that are taken to make these children. That's the implication there, I think. Andrew Mann further confessed that on the Holyrood day, the Queen of Elfin and her company rode white horses alongside the devil, who appeared out of snow in the form of a stag. Now that's interesting because he's using all the imagery of Christ, and even calling the devil Christ Sunday is interesting because the white stag is often reminiscent of Christ. But see, this one appears out of snow, so it's more of an illusion. It's something that has the appearance of something that it's not. She and her companions had human shapes, yet were as shadows, and they were playing and dancing wherever they pleased. So yeah, again, the idea that they are shadowy and that there's something unreal about them. Bessie Dunlop in 1576 confessed that the dead man's spirit she had congress with, Tom Reed, was one of the good neighbors or brownies who dwelt at the court of Elfhame, and that they had come to take her away, but she refused to comply, thereby angering Tom. When interrogated, Bessie denied having carnal relations with Tom, though he once took her by the apron and half had her gangen with him to Elfhame. Okay, that's a bit I'm not going to understand exactly. Bessie was informed that the Queen had secretly visited her before, and according to Tom, when Bessie lay in bed in childbirth, it was the Queen of Elfhame who, in the guise of a stout woman, who had offered her a drink and prophesied her child's death and her husband's cure. And indeed, it was at the behest of this queen, who was his master, that Tom had come to Bessie at all. So in other words, she was there almost in a form of a midwife, or at least in somebody who might have been, if she's talking about her child's death, there have been some implications in some of these stories of abortion as well. So, and again, the Malleus Maleficarum, again, the Succubus podcast, I talk more about that, especially as it relates to that other work. The Queen's shape-shifting magic extends her to her own person. Andrew Mann's confession also noted she can be young or as old as she pleases. Marion Grant, of the same coven as Andrew Mann, witnessed the Queen as a fine woman clad in a white wallicud. Similarly, Isabel Gaudi's confession described the Queen of Faery as handsomely clothed in white linen and in white-brown clothes, then providing more food than Isabel could eat. Okay, so she's dressed in white, right? And in brown, which brown, of course, implies the natural world. But white, white tends to, at least in Western culture, has more of an implication of purity. And as we're going to see with Thomas the Rhymer, he mistakes the Queen of Faery for the Queen of Heaven. And it says, in a ballad, 1583, on the Bishop Patrick Adamson refers to Alison Pearson participating in the fairy ride. The Dictionary of the Older Scottish Tongue also giving the entry Elfine Fairyland, and gives Semple's ballad as an example of usage. And in 1801, John Leyden identified them with Nick Nevin, which we talked about in the last podcast. So, okay. So now let's get on to the ballads. So the first one is one that I'd read a long time ago called Thomas the Rhymer. And this was says Thomas Learmont, or True Thomas, was a Scottish laird and reputed prophet from Earlston. His gift of prophecy was linked to his poetic ability. He is often cited as the author of the English Sir Tristram, a version of the Tristram legend, and some lines in Robert Manning's Chronicle may be the source of this association. In literature, he appears as the protagonist in the tale about Thomas the Rhymer, carried off by the Queen of Elfland, and returned having gained the gift of prophecy, as well as the inability to tell a lie. The tale survives in medieval verse romance in 5 manuscript, as well as the popular ballad Thomas Rhymer, which is called Child Ballad number 37. So we talk about they talk about the prophecies that he has, but I will tell you the quote here. And I'm going to read, well, there's Robert Graves' version, and then there's the original Child Ballad 37a. It says, True Thomas lay o'er yon grassy bank, and he beheld a lady gay, a lady that was brisk and bold, come riding o'er the ferny brae. True Thomas he took off his hat, and bowed low down till his knee. All hail thou mighty Queen of Heaven, for your peer on earth I never did see. Oh no, True Thomas, she says, that name does not belong to me. I am but the Queen of Elfland, and I've come here for to visit thee. Now, in Graves's version, he puts at the end, I'm not the Queen of Heaven, Thomas. That name does not belong to me. I am but the Queen of fair Elfame, come out to hunt in my folly, which is a different way of saying that. Okay, so with Thomas the Rhymer, and Thomas the Rhymer's poem is interesting because that's also the one in which they talk about the 3 roads that one take. You know, there's the path to heaven, but is beset by thorns and briars. And then there's the path to hell, though some will say it's the path to paradise or some similar word. I don't have it in front of me, so I'm just I'm paraphrasing. But then there's the middle way, which leads to Elfland or to Elfame. Okay, so that's interesting. The idea is that that this lands in the middle road. It's in the middle. This is a place that is in that's in the middle. So again, there's this liminal implication that it's a place that's in between heaven and hell. Okay, but we also think about the middle way in other things. For example, if you're a Buddhist, and I'm not, again, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting a connection between Buddhism and this kind of folklore. You know, the middle way is actually the preferred way. You know, it's where we are trying to. You know, we have this kind of we think of the middle way as being the balance point, right? Though that's probably not always the case. As I've mentioned, it's not so much that you want to be in the middle between 2 sides as you would rather be being able to move in between those 2 sides, to flow between those 2 sides rather than be on one side or the other. Now, the other place where we see Queen of Elfame or Queen of Faery mentioned is in Tam Lin. And it says, in here she's a more sinister figure who captures mortal men and entertains them in her subterranean home, but then uses them to pay a tine to hell, which is a tithe. And so I'll just read this quote from here. This is from Tam Lin, Child's Ballad number 39a. And ance it fell upon a day, a cold day and a snow, when we were frae the hunting come, that frae my horse I fell. The Queen of Fairies, she caught me, in yon green hill do dwell. Yeah, in the hills, right? And pleasant is the fairyland, but an eerie tale to tell, I at the end of 7 years, we pay a tine to hell. I am so fair and full of flesh, I feared it be myself. So, in other words, he's worried that he has been taken to Fairyland because he's going to be a tithe to hell that's paid. So again, a very strong Christianization of this idea. So there's this idea of the sinister nature, and again, it implies that the price for paying for playing with this illusion or allowing yourself to be taken in by it is hell, right? This is another way of saying that the Queen of Fairy, who it may not be totally wrong that she might represent the bounty of the earth or the sensuality of the earth, that what she has to offer you is somehow going to lead you to hell, which completely fits in with biblical ways of looking at things. And certainly if you're going to look at Christian medieval texts, that would definitely be the thing. Now, Tam Lin, just to give you the synopsis of this, and again, I just pulled the Wikipedia synopsis. Most variants begin with the warning that Tam Lin collects either a possession or the virginity of any maiden who passed through the forest of Carterhaugh. When a young woman, usually called Janet or Margaret, goes to Carterhaugh and plucks a double rose, Tam appears and asks her why she has come without his leave and taken what is his. She states that she owns Carterhaugh because her father has given it to her. In most variants, Janet then goes home and discovers she is pregnant. And some variants pick up the story at this point. When asked about her condition, she declares that her baby's father is an elf whom she will not forsake. In some versions, she is informed of an herb that will induce abortion. Well, in all the variants, when she returns to Carterhaugh and picks a plant, either the same roses as on her earlier visit or the herb, Tam reappears and challenges her action. She asks him whether he was ever human, either after that reappearance or in some versions immediately after their first meeting resulted in her pregnancy. Tam Lin reveals that, though he was once a mortal man, he was imprisoned in Carterhaugh by the Queen of Fairies after she kidnapped him by catching him when he fell from his horse. He goes on to tell Janet that the fairies give one of their people as a tithe to hell at midnight every 7th Halloween. That sounds like it's loaded with tropes. He asks Janet for her help in freeing him and receives her agreement. He then instructs her to come to the forest at the time of the tithe, during which he'll be in the company of numerous fairy knights. He tells her that she'll recognize him by his white horse. Janet must pull him down from his horse, thus making her the one to catch him this time and hold him tightly. He warns her that the fairies will attempt to make her drop him by turning him into all manners of beasts, but states that none of these forms will actually cause her harm, because obviously they're an illusion. Tam Lin will eventually take the shape of burning coal. When this occurs, Janet is to throw him in a well, whereas he will appear as a naked mortal man from whom Janet must hide. She does as she is asked and wins her knight, though the success angers the Queen of Fairies as the latter accepts her defeat. So, yeah, the Tam Lin version, that's the one that I say reminds me of Greek mythology, particularly the figures of Proteus and Nereus, who are actually both described as the old man of the sea. And they are often considered to be gods who probably predated Poseidon as the god of the sea. And when they are encountered, they have the gift of prophecy, but you have to catch them and they will shift into a variety of different shapes, and you have to hang on to them and not be scared off. And then eventually they will stop and they will tell you what you want to know. But you have to go through all kinds of deceptive permutations first. We see this happen to Menelaus, and he talks about it in the Odyssey. And then there's also, when he has to finding out how he's going to get home. He talks to Proteus. And Nereus, I believe, is approached by Heracles. And again, it's a similar thing where they change all into all these various shapes, and the hero has to hang on to this to get to the form, to them to finally stop changing forms and give them the true information that they need. So there's this implication of having to weather a certain kind of deception in order to get to the truth of something. So these are some of the main mentions of the Queen of Elfame, Robert Graves' work notwithstanding. And yeah, so we have this, so we have a number of motifs here. First of all, we have the liminal motif, where they're not bad enough for heaven, but not, not bad enough for hell. that was a slip, wasn't it? Not good enough for heaven and not bad enough for hell. Again, when you live in a dichotomized kind of cultural mythology or cultural religious belief, then that's the place where they're going to fit in, because Christian mythology has frequently taken the view that it takes a very dim view of the earth. They take the Adam and Eve story as a sign that the earth is corrupt, that nature is corrupt. And by the way, as I've said many times, and it's worth saying again, part of the reason that we don't treat the earth with very much respect is because probably unconsciously we still have that association. All the people who say, don't worry about climate change, God will take care of it, So it's But on the other hand, the idea that through science we're going to totally be able to fix it too is also, I don't know. Anyways, I think the Earth will survive us. I mean, we'll be gone long before the Earth is, I think. But anyway, that's an aside. So we have this land where so the idea is that it's apparently beautiful, but that there's something that's not true about it. So it almost gets into the ideas that we also see in Buddhism and ideas about yielding worldly attachment, right? That being attached to the things of the world, that there's something illusory about it. And I think that's really what these tales are really trying to point to. That these apparently, and of course, this apparently beautiful woman and this beautiful host with all their beautiful food is really just an illusion. And now the way fairies tend to actually operate, okay? Now I can only speak from my own experience being in Ireland, and I've talked about this in other places. I used to actually do a class where I would talk about fairies and fairy lore, and then I would talk and I would show some photos and some audio from my own experiences. But one of the most, I had several experiences like this when I was living in Ireland. One of the most remarkable ones was when I went to the site of the Second Battle of Moytura, basically in County Sligo. I went with, basically there's a man called Michael Keneally, okay, and I forget what the name of his site is now, but when I looked up if I could do tours of these area, he will do like these kind of Irish folklore tours. Picks you up in Sligo somewhere. I think that's where we had met. And then we kind of set out an itinerary, and I paid him, his fee, and he drove me to these different places. And we went to to Moytura, the second. There's two battlefields. That's why I say the second one, because the first one's supposed to be in County Mayo. This one's in County Sligo. And we climbed the hill, and it's a pretty well-marked path up the hill. And then there's kind of this, I forget what they call them. It's that stone kind of little structure that comes up from the ground that's made that's the name. I know what it is. The name for them is eluding me at the moment. But in any case, there's kind of that, and then you kind of go up over the hill, and then there's the site where where Lugh, the god Lugh, was supposedly asks each member of the Tuatha De Danann what they're bringing to the battle. Nearby is the river where the Morrigan mates with the Dagda, and then promises her help because he has sex with her. Promises the help to have victory in that battle, which she does. So battle against the Fomorians, and then of course there's a Neolithic tomb on the site as well. It's kind of these undulating hills, and you can look down on the loch that's down below that is connected with the mythology of Balor, the great Eye of Balor that falls into the loch. So we have this landscape, and so we go, and it was kind of a rainy, miserable day, like it is frequently, I hate to say, in Ireland. They do have some really beautiful days, but you not always the luck of the draw, and it could be crappy one minute and nice the next. So it's very, very varied weather landscape if you've never been there, but. We went up. Now, I had brought two pendulums with me. One of them is made from Stonehenge stone. I mean, from the blue stone. Not literally from Stonehenge, but... And I had another one, which is an obsidian one that I use sometimes for different things that I'm doing. So, I had them... And now, mind you, I had a raincoat on that has very, very deep pockets that zipper, okay? So, there was no, oh, something fell out of my pocket kind of thing. And when we were up there, we went to all the places and looked at stuff. And then when we went to leave... we're walking around and we can't find the way out. The way out is gone. We can't. And Michael's he's like, after a while, he's like, this is quite serious. He's like, I don't know how to get out of here. And because we were going back to that same stone structure, but the path seemed to have just completely vanished. And then I finally was just like, okay, I know what's going on here. So I was like, look, I said, we're tired. Nobody came here doing any disrespect. Just I was getting ready to turn my coat inside out, which is actually the thing that you do when you're in that kind of situation. But I said, just do me a favor and show us the path. I was getting a little frustrated because I was tired at that point. And so all of a sudden, Michael's like, oh, wait, there it is. And the path immediately appeared before us. However, when I went back to after we were finished visiting all the sites we were going to visit, and I went back to my room, I had never taken the pendulums out of my pocket, but then when I reached in, the black one was there, but the one that was made from bluestone had completely vanished. And so, yeah, I firmly believe that they took it because it never turned up anywhere. I mean, I went through everything. It's not like, oh, maybe it was in your pocket and you missed it. Like, no, it was gone. But that was one experience. I've had other experiences too. I've had experiences in England as well. But you have these things where the fairies, like the idea is that they're tricksters. They kind of move you out of your realm, and they trick you with certain deceptions of things that look like they're good things, but they're not. Like that's the implication there. And when I remember, I think I was talking to Munich Smith, who was introduced to me by my host. Because he does some kind of an underworld Ireland like walking tour, and I remember she introduced me like the last 3 days that I was staying there. I was like, how come you didn't introduce me to him earlier? She's like, I don't know, because I guess she just thought because I do scholarship and stuff that I might know more about some of these things than him. And I was like, no, he knows quite a bit, and you do want to get the local information, but I remember telling him this story about Moytura, and he was like, "Oh," he says, "so you stepped on a stray sod then?" And that's what they call it. It's the idea, because somehow not only do you lose your sense of place, but also what can happen in those is you lose your sense of time. I can't tell you how many times I'd be walking down a certain place, just normal things like walking from the house to the train station, say. And all of a sudden, it's like, okay, this should have been, 10 minutes, and somehow it's an hour. Like, what happened? Like the weird leaps of time. And that's why I always think with Fairyland, it's very interesting to talk about time. You'll have people who are abducted and they're gone for years, and then it turns out they were only gone for a day. Or they think they're only gone for a day, and they've been gone for years, like the American kind of Rip Van Winkle type story, right? It's just the way that they are. There's a deception because space, time, and our idea of reality is completely messed up when we deal with fairy. Okay, and with Elfhame. So who is the Queen of Elfhame then? I mean, we see these different versions. Shakespeare obviously has Titania as Queen of the Fairies. We have all of these different kinds of variations. Many Italian witches believed in the historical existence of a woman or goddess named Aradia, who brought about a revival of Italian witchcraft, traveling the country and preaching the old pagan religion of Diana, whom they called Queen of Fairies. That sounds like a very much a modern witchcraft idea, but maybe has some. I know there is Charles Godfrey Leland's Aradia, the Gospel of Witches. So this is probably one of the sources for that. There was a Romanian pagan sect known as the Calusari, who during the Middle Ages worshipped a mythical empress whom they sometimes called Arada, naming her as Queen of the Fairies. The Calusari dancers were the followers of the Fairy Queen, and their dances were thought to have originated in the Otherworld. That'd be an interesting thing to explore, because I don't know a whole lot about that. Actually, if we're talking about Romania, we're getting back into Slavic lore. I don't know, might have to talk to Joanna about this one. Similar Macedonian dance troupes were called Rusalia or fairies, and you see the term Rusalka is very close. And Rusalka, actually, they're usually the spirits of women who have drowned, but they become these kinds of nature spirits. So again, we have these different origin stories. Like fairies, they were responsible for bringing fertility to the land. The Italian Carnival Society of the Cavallino assembled under the banner of Erodiade, a name for the Queen of Fairies, possibly synonymous with the witch goddess Herodias, and grew to prominence in the Middle Ages. It had an ancient pagan origin. It was exclusively male. Its members dressed in women's clothes, and they wore makeup. They always gathered in odd numbers, such as 9 or 11. The Catholic Church persecuted them as pagans who worshipped the goddess Diana. And King James I's book on demonology equated fairies with devils in no uncertain terms, and advised people who had them in their homes to get rid of them immediately. Kind of like calling the exterminator, I guess. Not sure how that works. Writing in the 1701, Orkney vicar Reverend John Brand said that the fairies were evil spirits seen dancing and feasting in wild places, because of course we all know dancing and feasting is just so terrible. English Puritan writers of the 16th and 17th centuries, I mean, really say no more there, believed all fairies were devils. Well, of course they do. And if people worked with fairies, it was considered they had renounced their Christian faith, something often reiterated in trial records. In 1670, Jean Weir confessed that she had performed a ritual at the bidding of a fairy so that all her troubles would depart. Afterwards, she found that she had a wonderful ability with spinning, but this made her afraid, and she stayed indoors for 20 days weeping because she thought that what she had done in working with a fairy was, in effect, a renunciation of her baptism. And yeah, so we have this kind of... a lot of this information that we tend to have about fairies, as I mentioned earlier, does come out of this biblical or particularly Christian tradition that we are seeing from this particular time period around the 16th century and 16th century probably up through Victorian times. And of course, more Victorian ideas about fairies tend to be fanciful, just like their conception of angels. It's something romanticized in a lot of ways. And as these kinds of cute little Tinkerbell kind of figures. And, really the thing is, people who actually live in places where there are fairies. Iceland also, there's a lot of fairy lore, and there was a whole documentary on that, which was really, really interesting. And again, these are all the people of the hills. They'll talk about like the hill, like a door appearing in the hill and you being able to go inside. Like there's all this discussion about this, which some people write off as fanciful rubbish. But the thing is, but I wouldn't write it off that way. Certainly you'll find in these places that there is still a very strong belief in fairies, not just because people are superstitious, but because they've had some kind of an experience that makes them go, you want to tread very carefully there. Certainly there's definitely some kind of a force that you don't want to, that you want to tread lightly with, that you want to treat with a certain kind of respect. I think I'm going to end with probably one of my favorite stories about that, which was when I was in Ireland, again, Sligo. If you go down, there's something called there's a passage tomb, okay, that they have, and I'm trying to remember the exact name of it. I've been to it. I think they just call it like the Neolithic passage tomb or something. I think there might be a name for it. But I remember the first time I went to Sligo, and I saw signs for this when I was walking through town, and I'm like, what is this tomb? There's a tomb, and I want this passage tomb. Where is it? So I remember going to they have like a tourism office, and I had arranged I think I had arranged a visit out to Drumcliff and things like that. But I was talking to them, and I said, by the way, what's this passage tomb? And she goes, oh, that. She said, so she explained to me how to get there, and she's like, she said, it's on a roundabout, and in a neighborhood. She told me it was on a roundabout, and then she said, she didn't explain the story to me. I don't want to misquote the situation, but she had said, she just said, don't ask. That's what she had actually said. She was like, just don't ask. It was almost like she was embarrassed to even mention it. Now they have more distinct signs for the passage tomb when I'd returned to Sligo in later years. But I had been, when I went there, it's literally, you walk into this neighborhood of houses, right? And in the middle of it is just this little roundabout, cars go around. And there you see the curbstones sticking up of this passage tomb. Now the story, I had to go look the story up, was that the locals, when they decided they were going to build these, I don't know if they were council houses or what they were specifically meant to be in this neighborhood, but when they made the decision to do that, people said, oh, there's a fairy mound there. This passage tomb. Passage tombs are often also regarded as fairy mounds. And they said, no, you can't, because they're portals to the other world, basically. And it's just like, no, you can't. They were like, they were afraid of them building in that area. So they ended up leaving these curbstones in the middle, in this little roundabout, and building the whole community around it. And the local parish priest, or the Catholic Church, whoever the official was, said, "That's ridiculous. You're gonna dig that up. You dig the whole passage tomb up and just get rid of it. Like it's evil, right? Or it represents some kind of superstitious rubbish, right? That kind of thing." And the people were like, no, you want to get, and they didn't want the church digging it up either, because they said, we don't want to incur the wrath of whatever's there. So what they ended up doing was putting this giant marble crucifix, like right in the middle of this little like collection of curbstones, with images of like, the Virgin Mary, like praying at it, and maybe the other women, like the whole scene at the foot of the cross. And that's what the woman said to me. Now I remember. She said, yeah, there's this big cross in the middle of it. She's like, just don't ask. That's what she had said. Now I remember exactly what she said. And I was like, wow, that is just like almost tacky and offensive, where it is. It's just like, why this is just in the middle of a council housing. But this was their answer to dealing with the fairies, was to stick a cross on top of it. So I said, yeah, wow, there's a lot that you can just tell about fairy belief and about fairy belief with respect to Christianity just by looking at this one single monument. So Queen of Elfame, Queen of the Fairies, generally is considered to be, I think, somewhat of a jovial character. There are some stories that are very sinister and suggest that she collects, beautiful humans as a tithe to hell. But we see that only in Tamlin. Certainly the beliefs that are spread about fairies, some of them do seem to ring true with experience, that they are tricksterish in nature, that they can mess with your perception of space and time. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of what's been said around them has more to do with the way in which they're connecting these in-between figures, these fairy figures, as representing some kind of deception of the devil, the pretty things, or if you want to say that the temptations of the material world, which of course in that view is corrupt. But a lot of people who work with fairies don't necessarily see it that way. It's true, you're dealing with something very archaic, and I feel that dealing with fairies is a little bit more like dealing with this archaic religion, because it's the idea that if they do favors for you, there's certain rules about that, and if you want favors from them, there's certain rules about that. And that's often the way one negotiates with an ancient deity or local spirit, is you make certain offerings. Although it's been said that if you start to make fairy offerings, like let's just say you think you have them in your garden and you start leaving things out, you better not stop leaving them out, because once you do, it's like your luck may turn for the better when you're leaving things out. But then once you stop, like, I don't know, you go on vacation for a couple weeks or something, then bad things could start to happen. So they're tricky to deal with, but they do seem to be natural forces, and certainly people who do practice modern witchcraft do bring them into certain ceremonies. It's just a question of appropriately calling them and then politely dismissing them. There's the whole thing of you never say thank you to a fairy because they don't want to hear that. And yeah, so there's a whole lot of rules. That would be a whole separate discussion, but yeah, interesting discussion here of the Queen of Elfame. I'm sure there's many other examples we could talk about. We could talk about the Shakespearean Titania, Oberon Titania, but I think probably this is sufficient for one episode. So if that is something people want me to pursue, they can certainly let me know. So yeah, there was one other thing I wanted to talk about here. What was it? There was something about Starhawk, actually. What did she say about it? Where Starhawk actually mentions it in her. I know where it was. It was an article I read on alternative religions of like the late 70s to the 80s, and they were talking about when feminist witchcraft came to be a thing, and how Starhawk had declared that the Queen of the Fairies. Actually, I think I have the quote here. The fairies, breeding cattle in the stony hills and living in turf-covered round huts, preserved the old religion. Clan mothers, called the Queen of Elfame, which means Elfland, led the covens together with the priest, the sacred king, who embodied the dying god and underwent a ritualized mock death at the end of his term in office. They celebrated the 8 feasts of the wheel with wild processions on horseback, singing, chanting, and the lighting of ritual fires. That also gets into the wild hunt, which is another separate idea, or connected idea. The covens who preserved the knowledge of the subtle forces were called Wicca or Wiccae, from the Anglo-Saxon root word, I can speak, meaning to bend or shape. They were those who could shape the unseen to their will. Healers, teachers, poets, and midwives, they were central figures in every community. Yeah, and this is actually like Robert Graves and a lot of stuff. And I think Graves might be her source for this. And yeah, let's just, if I want to be a little less harsh about it, we'll just say take that with a grain of salt. Because really that's not historically accurate. So, yeah, I knew there was one other piece I'd wanted to bring in here. So anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you are not subscribed, either on audio podcast format or on my YouTube channel, please do consider subscribing. If you want to support this podcast and the other work that I'm doing with the school, with publications, and I also do personal coaching work with people, please visit patreon.com/Catonia. If you would like to join, membership benefits. Actually, members who have been with me for a while at the $5 tier and above are getting actually free classes at the school as well. So that is a new perk that I'm doing to kind of fulfill the course perk that I have, because I hadn't built the old courses that I had. I'd gotten rid of. So yeah. So in addition to that, we have you can follow me on social media, Catonia Podcast, one word, on X and on Instagram. And Instagram is where I usually am at. And also Facebook, 2 words, Cattonia Podcast. And it is just Cattonia on YouTube, though you can find it at Cattonia Podcast, 1 word. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.